Hello, everyone. Welcome to this delayed version of the Jim Kleiber Show. I feel guilty for not doing it at the time I said I would do it at. It's now 5 p.m. on October 20th, 2020, Tuesday. Um, I was planning to record at 4 p.m., and yet I went out to the apple orchard slash pumpkin patch slash cider mill with my parents, and it was a little busier than we had anticipated. But it was nice to be out there. It was nice to realize that fall is indeed here, whether we want it to be or not. The wind blows cold and rips right through the fabric, all the way to the bones. So it cuts right to the core. It was nice to get out there and be in nature. I think it's easy to forget that when we're in like suburban environments, or even more so urban environments, or really just in the house all day, there aren't that many living things around us. So in the house, we have the humans, at least in my house, we have humans, and we have a few plants, and maybe a few insects flying around here and there, but not too many. Some houses may have dogs or cats or guinea pigs or some other type of animals, but it's not the same feeling of being in on a farm. Everywhere I'm walking, there's grass, there's trees, there's bugs, there's all sorts of types of plants. Be surrounded by pumpkins and raspberries, and even had lavender plants, and what else? So many different types of apple trees, and the apples, and you can see the worms going into some of the apples. Just a different feeling to be surrounded by so much life. They talk about humans, and talk about us trying to be a interplanetary species, living on Mars or living on the moon. I wonder what the impact on our psychology will be just living away from so much life. They talk about they call it forest bathing, but it's, I guess, a Japanese practice with obviously a Japanese name, but going out into the forest and just soaking up the energy there. And I really think there is something just to being out in nature, and being out in nature, being surrounded by a lot of different types of life, plants and fungi and birds and bees and insects and all these different things flying around us. Felt nice. At one point, the cars kind of stopped. We got a little way, further away from the road. It was quiet, just standing next to some old Granny Smith trees. It's nice just to see how trees age. They had the old trees over here, then you had the young trees over here. They both had apples on them, but the young trees looked a bit flimsy, whereas the old trees were kind of strong and sturdy, and they had lots of leaves, and you had to search for the apples. Just nice to get away from it all sometimes. Get away from the hustle and bustle of the urban life, or the suburban life. And the internet. The internet's... there are living things on the internet, but we're really just looking at a screen. A glowing screen, talking into, whether it's a computer or whether it's a phone or so many other devices that we have, are pretty much just screens or microphones. So we see living things there, but we may not soak up as much of the living zest as we do when we're in person with something or someone. So it was nice to get out there. We went out there after we dropped off our ballots. So we voted. It's October 20th. I've voted absentee before. I remember last time in 2016 when I voted. I was in California at the time, but still registered here in Michigan. And so I sent a ballot, and I didn't realize that the ballot had to arrive by Election Day. And so I was sending it just a few days before Election Day. And I got quite worried that it wouldn't arrive. And I was very strongly hoping that Donald Trump would not win the election. And so I think I sent it priority mail. I sent it like 1 or 2 day express. Paid way too much money, but really wanted it to arrive. Now, I don't know if it ever did arrive. I hope it did, but I don't know. But now I know that my absentee ballot has arrived, because my parents and I dropped the ballots off at the drop box in front of the city clerk's office. So the only thing that could go wrong, I guess, is that maybe the signatures don't match. I tried my best, but sometimes you never know. And that would be the only struggle, I guess. So I feel very confident that my vote will go in, that it will count, and that I don't have to pay attention to so many of the ads right now. That's what my parents and I were laughing about. We go, oh, so all these ads, all this money they're spending now to try to get our attention, to sway us in one direction or the other. Doesn't matter. We already voted for the whole slate. So doesn't matter, what about the local or the state or even the national elections. We're done. We don't have to do anything. We can't do anything more, really, from a voting standpoint. Phew. I mean, we are already trying to ignore many of the ads because I think most of us had made up our minds, for the president, for the Senate, for U.S. House of Representatives, and even for local elections as well, state elections. So it's just nice to know that it's not on our plate anymore. It feels like a sense of relief. Okay, we didn't screw it up. We did our job. We filled it out properly. We filled in the right bubbles. And now we just wait to verify that the ballot counts. Because they have a tracking system now, which will tell you if it was received. I think if it was received. If it was received, it means that it was received and the signature is valid, at least here in Michigan. That's what that means. I think it also gives you a few steps before that. So once the application is received to receive the absentee ballot, and then once the ballot is mailed out to the individual. And then the third step would be that once the ballot is received at the clerk's office to be processed for voting. I thought about it. I thought, wow, this is interesting. If it allows early voting, and like Michigan, I don't know if we've really had early voting at the polls. I don't know if it's allowed. So this idea of voting early for this election felt kind of nice. And I think what it can do is it could really change the dynamics of political advertising. Because if people know that everyone is voting on November 3rd, then certain political advertisements or news stories or things that people are trying to leak to sway the vote can come out a few days before that. But if someone leaks a story on October 28th, doesn't matter to me, I already voted. So one way to kind of screw up that timing and that strategy is to vote before they have the opportunity to mess with it. Well, then you could say maybe they'll leak the story on October 15th, or they'll leak it before early voting starts. Yes, but spreading out that punch may not be as effective. If they're trying to have this one huge sledgehammer punch that they're going to deliver on the 28th because they think everyone's voting on the 3rd. Well, if half the people or 25% of the people vote before October 20th, and another 25% vote between October 20th and October 28th, et cetera, it can weaken some of the strength of these political advertisements or these stories that seem to drop at the last moment. Because it is a kind of a game of information and pseudo information. It's a game of stories, really. And trying to sell the right story to the right audience at the right time to influence their behavior. I mean, at the end of the day, that is advertising and it is propaganda, right? I mean, they're not so different. It's communication to persuade people to take a specific action. With advertising, it's often to convince someone or persuade someone to buy a product. But with propaganda and in more kind of political spaces, it's often to get somebody to vote in a specific direction for someone, to get someone to vote against someone, to get someone to not vote, to get someone to dislike certain groups in society, within their society, or to dislike certain groups in another society, or to like certain groups, or to trust certain groups or distrust certain groups. So there's many arguable goals of propaganda and advertising. Putting out a story with goals and intent of driving people in a specific direction to take a specific action. And so just stepping back from that a little bit, I think when we look at platforms like Facebook and we look at platforms like Google and these ad-driven platforms, Twitter, Snapchat, and many others, we go, oh, they're just ad-driven, this and that. But an advertisement is really not that different than propaganda. Again, what's the goal? What's the intent? Is often to influence a behavior, to influence a human to take a specific action. Just with propaganda, it's less influencing someone to buy something. It's more influencing someone to vote for someone or against someone. Or again, the demoralization and trying to convince someone to not trust somebody else. And I think that's where we see a lot of the disinformation, is to come in and basically say, oh, you should not trust this group. This group does not care about you. This group is not telling you the truth. They're lying to you. And stories. They're stories. Stories don't require 100% truth. Stories are nonfiction. Stories are fiction. Stories are blends of nonfiction and fiction. And stories are this swirl of true information and false information. And sometimes the best stories have a lot of false information in them, because it makes for a better story. And I think this is what we see with some of the political propaganda, especially the political advertising, I'd say from all sides. Definitely it's the strategy or the tactics I see a lot that Trump uses, is that he seems to care more about the story than he cares about the truth of the details. The details don't matter so much as what matters is the overall arc of the story. Arc of the story. Oh, does that one have an H at the end? I don't think so. But so then these platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and we see them being used a lot for advertising, for politics. And some of us get frustrated and we think, oh, they're telling a false story. You should take that down. It's not true. But do companies also tell false stories when they advertise on platforms? Like, there's some laws and regulations against it in the US, but how many of them gets, people skirt around them? I know, what's an example? I mean, there's some companies who get caught for doing it. I think Theranos was the name of a company that was selling this beautiful dream of a very simple blood test that could diagnose many different diseases. I think a very small device or something that could recognize many diseases through a simple blood test. And I think they got prosecuted for quite serious fraud. And so there are ways, if in telling false stories, in making up many of the details of the stories, there are penalties for individuals and companies in the US when it comes to business. I wonder if we have similar laws related to politics. How much are you allowed to lie in a political ad? Truth in advertising is a phrase I've heard a lot through my life, but I wonder if it's truth in political advertising as well. Does it matter? Does it matter if somebody falsely represents their campaign or their candidate? Maybe it matters ethically. Maybe you're not supposed to do it ethically, or people don't want you to do it, but legally, does it matter? I think I remember growing up, there was something called false advertising, where as a company, you weren't allowed to advertise a false price. You weren't allowed to lie about certain things. in terms of your advertising. I just wonder if that even applies to politics at all. And if it did, is it too hard to enforce? Is it too hard to know the difference? Does it really apply too much to business? Is it just something that I got stuck in my head when I was a kid and thought it was a big deal? I don't know. I wonder about these things, because I think a lot on Twitter and Facebook these days we're seeing efforts or encouragement to ban certain types of communication, especially ones that spread falsehoods about especially COVID-19, but also about other aspects in the political sphere, vaccines and these things, conspiracy theories, or what, And the challenge is, a conspiracy theory is a conspiracy theory maybe to 90% of the people, but for 10% of the people, it's a conspiracy. It's not a theory. It's not a hypothesis. It's the truth. And so banning that communication can make it look like, oh, these people are trying to hide the truth from me. Same thing with people who are anti-vaccine, or people who believe in what I would call fringe ideas. Fringe idea doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. I would say that it means 5 to 10% of the people believe it, or less. That doesn't make it right or wrong, but it means that 90% or the overwhelming majority of society don't believe it. And being in that small minority, if the overwhelming majority just tries to ban that content, it can make that person feel even more isolated. And I think if they're in that group already where they're having these beliefs and they're with a small percentage of the population, they may already feel isolated. And so banning it may push them deeper into isolation. I wonder what other strategies we could take, because we think, okay, it's banning the advertising, don't allow any political advertising, or don't this, but people tell stories in so many different formats. It doesn't have to come from a paid ad on Facebook or Twitter. It could be from a fake persona on Twitter that's spreading a story. It could be a real person spreading a fake story. It could be a real person spreading a semi-fake story. It could be a real person who spreads 90% of the time true stories, 5% semi-true stories, and 5% blatantly false stories, and mixes them all together. How do we ban it? Do we ban it? How, what impact does it have if we ban it? Why do people believe these things? Maybe some of them are true. I don't believe a lot of the anti-vaccine. I don't believe the flat earther. I don't believe many of these that I would say many people label as conspiracy theories. And at the same time, as a person who comes up with, or who studied innovation for a long time and worked in it in a while, and somebody who kind of pushes the bounds, I would say, on what society is looking at, this technological breakthroughs come through from the people who are in the fringe perspectives. A lot of times, the status quo doesn't invent new things. One of the stories I like a lot is the story about the guy who basically realized that ulcers were caused by a bacteria named H. pylori. I know this because when I was living in Tanzania, I got diagnosed with H. pylori, and they gave me pills to get rid of it. And for most of my life, I still hear it. But for most of my life, I had heard that ulcers are caused by drinking too much pop, or eating spicy foods, or having fatty foods, from stress, things like this. And this guy was, I think, a doctor out in maybe Australia, New Zealand, I think Australia. But he said, no, they're actually caused by a bacterium. And people said, no, you're lying, whatever. And I think this guy drank a vial of H. pylori and got horrible ulcers. Horrible ulcers. and then took antibiotics and was fine. And then fast forward, and I think he won a really big prize, if not the Nobel Prize for medicine for this discovery. So here's an example. Here's me telling a story. I don't remember all the true details. I may have embellished in some aspects. Maybe he wasn't a doctor. Maybe he was. Maybe he was a biologist. I don't know. Maybe he was from Australia. Maybe he was from New Zealand. I don't know. Maybe he's from somewhere else. Maybe maybe he didn't win the Nobel Prize. Maybe he didn't win a prize at all. Maybe I just remember that falsely. Maybe he didn't actually discover this, but maybe he was the second or third person who did, but publicized it. I don't know. That's the challenge with telling stories, is that sometimes stories have a lot of uncertainties and we cover them over with certainty. It's hard to tell a story and say, well, this man from Australia, or was it New Zealand, or maybe he was from India. I can't remember where he was from. Okay, then go on to the next point. It breaks the rhythm of the story. And I do this quite often, where I can care so much about the accuracy of the story that I will stumble through the storytelling. There was a comedian that talked about this. I can't remember who it was, but he was saying that really boring stories to listen to. The person who was telling the story is like, wait, what was his name? Oh, it could have been this. It could have been that. Oh, never mind. Okay, so it was this. Oh, what did he say? Constantly pausing, looking for the exact accurate description of what happened instead of just speaking. That's the challenge, I guess, that storytelling can include a lot of falsities. I think another reason that some of the stories we tell include not 100% true or honest information is that in telling the story, we're often trying to hide some of these details. We don't necessarily want to share all the truth, even if we know it. I remember I picked up an old book that was about poetry, and it was a small book. I pick up big books, but I often only start reading the small ones. And I hope I still have it somewhere. And anyways, the book was talking about what it's like to write poetry and who writes poetry and famous poetry. And it said something about how anonymous poets will make their writing. So I think it said that almost all poetry includes the author's personal experience in one way, shape, or another, but it just depends on how directly it is included. Often, they may make up a different character. It could be their own name, could be very autobiographical and directly so. Or they could make up a name, or they can make up a whole world. I remember reading about Charles Schulz, the author of, the creator of Peanuts, and I believe two of the characters in there were representing him. I think it was Charlie Brown and Snoopy, was it? See, this is the this is the uncertainty. If I were more confident, I could just tell the story and it'd be fine, But I personally care about trying to get the story right. Okay, was it Charles Schulz? Was he talking about Charlie Brown and Snoopy? I could say it was just some guy who created this famous thing, and two of the characters were meant to represent him. But it doesn't have as much pizzazz if I say it that way. So coming back to political advertisements and campaigning and this, it's people tell a lot of stories, and a lot of the information is true, a lot of it's false, a lot of it's incomplete, and it's hard to know. And a lot of times they're telling the stories because they want to get us to take a certain action, to vote for them, to vote against them, to love our neighbor, to hate our neighbor, to not vote at all, to engage in politics or disconnect from politics, to go out and buy stuff, to not buy stuff, to spend, to save, to support certain initiatives, to fight against certain initiatives. Yeah, it's just It's a lot of storytelling. Oh, what else to say about this? I think there's a disconnect in a way in how we do politics in the US, in that there's the storytelling election campaigning aspect, and then there's the actual governance. And I was talking about this earlier with my parents, this idea that campaigning and electioneering is exciting. It craves attention. It wants someone who's good at storytelling, who's good at telling the story of the future, telling the story of their past, telling the story of how we come together, telling multiple stories. Very good at keeping an audience engaged while they're on television, while they're at rallies, while they're in small town halls, while they're one-on-one with people, while they're writing stories for newspapers, while they're tweeting, while they're basically telling all these stories to communicate with us, trying to keep our attention and make us feel excited to vote for them. Once they get into office, especially if they're running for a position like the president, they govern. One could argue that their role is to be kind of boring. Yes, still telling stories to the public, but not nearly as much. Telling a lot more stories internally to the organization. But a lot of it's making decisions. And a lot of it's reading and learning and not so much telling the story, but maybe absorbing information from what's going on. And it's absorbing information about things that may be quite boring. Not as in bad, but just as in quite routine, or quite routine. If I think about government at the local level, a lot of what government does is, keep the water running and keep the lights on and keep the roads fixed and maintain things, maintain basic infrastructure. Think about what the government does at a state or a national level. Pretty similar, make sure that the regulations and the standards are applied and enforced. So a lot of it's just checking to make sure that people are following the rules. Law enforcement is just checking to make sure that people are following the rules. Kind of the same thing. I mean, law enforcement maybe gets a little more, maybe much more exciting from different types of challenges that they face. And I'm not trying to downplay the challenges that someone would face in maintaining infrastructure. I think it's quite difficult and quite challenging. And, pipes burst in different ways. And when a pipe bursts, how to fix it, requires different solutions. And I'm not saying it's simple, like building dams and things like this. It's not simple work, but it's just maybe a little less exciting than the Hollywood super action movie, the superhero movie, which a lot of campaigns are. We portray them to be a superhero. Here is this superhero that's going to come save our country and reunite everyone and push this forward to the new generation, blah, 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 blah. And then they get in and they're supposed to just make sure that the garden is watered and the dog is fed. And, like the basic things of running a company or running an economy. I think the word economy comes from home. Is that right? Yeah, I think something inherent into the word economy is related to home and like management of the home. And a lot of that is really just cleaning and fixing things and organizing things and just making sure that things keep that don't deteriorate and don't fall apart. Yes, there's some new things that happen, but a lot of it is just maintenance work. And I think the storytelling, electioneering, campaigning seems a very far cry from a lot of the day-to-day activities of governing. So I wonder if we could look at elections a little differently. And yes, I'm excited for the person who can tell stories, and I like them to have that ability to tell stories, to engage the audience, to inspire people in the crowd. I really like that. I like how Obama could do that quite well, and some others in the past. I also want them to govern well. I also want them to be able to have consistent meetings and run meetings on time and have meetings that are effective and productive, and to not micromanage the employees, to trust the employees to do their work, to inspire people to come work for them, to basically just make sure that the machine keeps running. And sometimes those people are the ones who aren't the best at telling stories, because sometimes those people care more about the truth and the accuracy of what's happening than they do the overarching story. And sometimes they tell stories like, "Oh yeah, where is that guy from? Oh, the guy was. Hold on, let me look it up first." It's like, no, don't look it up first before you tell me the story. Just tell me the story. I don't really care. Say you're not sure and move on. But sometimes those people who care so much about the details are some of the best people for managing the country, because they care about the details. Make sure things don't fall apart. Make sure it keeps, things get fixed. Make sure things don't break in the first place. So anyway, it's just a little bit of conversation about the dichotomy of elections and the storytelling in elections and the political advertisements, and then the maintenance and the maybe humdrum or routine aspect of making stuff happen and continue to happen. This balance of, again, selling the dream or selling the nightmare, selling the story, versus actually making it happen, build the product, maintain the infrastructure, things like this. I'd say more often than not are contradictory skills. And with our elections, we often elect people who have the storytelling skill, but maybe not the building skill. And well, I already voted, so but I'm curious, if you haven't voted, like, I'd love to engage with you in conversation about this. Talk with me or talk with some other people. Really just talk about the balance between storytelling and its tendency to be true and false, and then the people who focus on rebuilding and repairing and maintaining often focus a lot more on the reality of what's happening, because they have to. If they don't, things fall apart. Anyways, y'all, hope this show and time worked well for you. If not, leave me a note in the comments, and we'll continue from there. Au revoir.